The next topic in ES6 is arrow functions. So what are arrow functions? Arrow functions are sometimes called as fat arrow functions, right? For the reason that if you look at my screen now, uh, arrow, this is an arrow, right? And this is a fat arrow, right? It looks little fatter than a normal arrow. Funny, right? Yeah. So what is the purpose of arrow functions? They completely simplify how we write functions, right? The function expressions become very, very simple. One other important uh, use of arrow function is they play around with the way how the this keyword works, right? So I'll show you what is the example of that in the last piece of this video. So before that, let's see how we can write an arrow function, right? So if you can see my screen now, this is a function which is a normal function, right? I'm just printing my name as first name and last name appended to it, and this is a normal function which I've written. Now how do I convert this function to an arrow function, right? The point number one, an arrow function is an anonymous function, right? So first thing is there is no function keyword that is required for it. So I can say, or I can declare the name, and I can say equals, and I can put an arrow this side, right? So this becomes a arrow function. There is no function keyword required to define an arrow function. I'll have to place a fat arrow symbol after the parenthesis and before the flower brackets, right? And this forms my basic arrow function. Simple, right? Yeah. So there are certain points which we'll have to remember while writing arrow functions, right? This is the first basic arrow function which you have written. How can we simplify this function? This is still more lines of code, right? How can we simplify the functions more, right? So let us say, let's if a particular arrow function has only one statement in it, then let me show you how it looks like. So say for example, let me declare it outside so that it's easy for me to demonstrate a one liner arrow function, right? Suppose I have something like this, right? There is only one line inside my arrow function. In that case, I do not have to give any flower brackets here, and I don't have to give any return statement here. So my arrow function becomes as simple as this, right? It looks very simple, right? So if you look at here, it is only one line. So I don't have to have any open and closing flower brackets, and I don't need to have a return statement there. If I have more number of statements, then yes, I definitely need to have open and close flower brackets, and I need to have a return statement, right? So let's say for example, right, so this is my one arrow function. Now say I want to pass first name as an argument to this function. So in that case, what do I do? So let's write a function from the beginning to make it simple and clear, right? So I'll write a function, usual normal function, say print or say get name, function get name, and I say return, and my name is name, right? It takes an argument here, and I say get name of, and I say Dave, right? So I can say console.log of this. So let me remove these two from here. So this is a normal function. So let us convert it to an arrow function now, right? So what do? We remove the function keyword first, and then I can say let, and I'll have to place an equal to symbol, and there should be a arrow after the arguments, right? And then since it is a one liner body inside my function, my opening and closing flower brackets are not required. Return statement is also not required. Simple. Now another improvement to this is, if there is only one parameter passed to an arrow function, then I don't have to have the open and closing parenthesis also. Very simple, right? Just a single line. Let's try to pick up another example and convert it to an arrow function. Function space double number, I'll say double number, and this takes a number as an argument, right? And then I can return number into 2, right? And then I say console.log, and I'll say double number of say 5, right? And you can see 10 here. So how do I convert this to an arrow function? I can say let, I don't need the function keyword, I've removed that, and I've placed uh, a arrow here, a fat arrow here to make it an arrow function. This is only one line, so I can remove my open and close flower braces here, and I can also remove my return keyword from here. And then since it is only one parameter, I can go ahead and remove this, right? Let's look at one more example, and this time let's pick up one of the uh, array helper methods where we have an iterator function, and let's see how we can convert that into an arrow function and how does the final syntax look like. So let's go back to our old example of summing up all the elements of an array. So let me say our numbers is equal to 1 2 3 4 5 and numbers dot, and let, what shall we pick up? Let me pick up a map function, right? Map, and let me say var, let's go back to our old example of squares equal to an empty array. Then I say map, I need to pass a function, an iterator function, and then my iterator function is going to take number, which is the element of the array, as an argument, and it is going to give me squares equal to, right? And I can say return number into number, and then I can say console.log squares, right? So this is how we wrote our ES6 syntax for writing a helper method, array helper method, which is a map array helper method, right? So how can I convert now this into, so this, I can remove the function keyword here, and I can make a place a fat arrow here, and I can remove the return keyword and remove the flower brackets as well, and then I don't need to put a semicolon also there. So it becomes very simple, right? And since it is only one parameter, I can choose to remove the parenthesis also, right? In ES5 we had some 5 lines of code. In map helper method we have 3 lines of code, and in arrow functions we have only just 1 line of code to do the same activity, right? Let me create a box. Let me define a constant rather. Let me say content of the box is apples and oranges, right? And the type of the box is say fruit box, it is, right? Fruit box. And say I want to write a method, say get box type, right? And this is going to be a function. Get box type is going to be a function, and this is going to print me the, or rather I can say return this dot type. If you can see here, this is a example which can demonstrate how this uh, keyword varies the based upon the place where we are using the keyword, right? The meaning of this varies based upon where we are using this, right? So let me define another function. I say get box contents, right? So here function, I want to print the contents of my box, right? So what are the contents of my box? It is apples and oranges. It is an array. So I'll have to first iterate over the content, right? So let me say this dot content, right? Dot, I have to iterate, right? Let me say for each content in my box, I have to do something, right? And this is say, um, let me say cont, right? And what am I going to do here? I'm going to print console dot log. Or let me just say what is there. So there you go. You can see that, right? It has printed me apples and oranges. I want to say apples in fruit box and oranges in fruit box. I want to append the type to the content of the array. So how can I do that? So let me go with the template literal. So I can do this and I can say dollar, right? How do I access? I can say this dot type, right? Oops, I don't see type defined, right? It is undefined. So how do I access the this keyword inside my function here, right? So normally in ES6, ES5 syntax, what do? We may end up either doing this, var self is equal to this, and then I will try to rectify this by using self, right? In that case, it prints me the type, right? Without this statement, if I try to just access this dot type, right, from an iterator function, I will not be able to access what is outside that, right? Or I can even there are even other methods to work around this problem, and then the same output can be attained. But how does the arrow function solve this problem? Let's look at that, right? So what I can do is, let's first convert this into arrow function. So how do I convert this into arrow function? I'll remove this function keyword and then I'll place a fat arrow here, right? And then I can remove this parenthesis since it is only one, right? And I can change this back to this. You see that? The same function which is converted into an arrow function, the meaning of this is different when you go with arrow function, right? So this is a very big advantage for you to go with arrow function. You don't have to take the trouble of binding the this keyword or assigning the this keyword to self and then using self back. All this trouble is saved for you when you use arrow function. So let's look at one last example of arrow function using two parameters, right? One simple example, just that we cover all the aspects of arrow function even with multiple parameters, right? Say multiply. Let me define a function called multiply, and it takes two parameters, a comma b, and then how do we return? Return a into b, right? I want to do some action over A and B, and then I want to multiply the result and display it. So say I say A is equal to A plus 10, and then I say B is equal to B plus 10, and then I can say A into B. There are like three statements now. Just to simulate the more number of lines in the function, I've written some function there. So I can say multiply of say 10 comma 10, or I say 10 comma 20, and then I say console.log of this, right? 600. So how do I convert this into an arrow function now? So I don't need the let keyword, the function keyword there, and I can say equal to, and I can after the argument list I can place an arrow function, and I have multiple lines of code here, so I cannot go and remove this here, right? And I also have multiple parameters here, so I cannot go and remove my parenthesis here, right? So this is the least which you can simplify for this arrow function. Suppose that you don't have any parameters, then also you are supposed to have parenthesis there. Only when you have only one parameter you can remove the parenthesis. Only when you have one line of code within your function body you can remove the return statement and the flower brackets. Hope I've made arrow functions clear.